Hey everyone, are you ready for this? It seems like a lot of you have been thinking about casual sex and how it relates to empowerment today. So we're going to dive deep into that. We're going to be looking at Keisha Solomon's book, The Illusion of Empowerment.
Yeah, it's definitely a timely topic, and there's a lot to unpack. I mean, if you think about it, even a few decades ago, casual sex wasn't something that we talked that much about openly, especially for women.
It's true. Now it's like we're constantly being told it's this symbol of freedom, like especially for women, it's the 21st century, so we can do what we want, right?
Right. But on the one hand, Solomon acknowledges all of the positive strides that we've made with sexual liberation since the 60s, with the sexual revolution and the women's liberation movement. Like all of these things were really important for challenging the norms
Yeah.
and giving women more autonomy. But I think where it gets kind of murky is when this whole idea that casual sex equals empowerment came into being. And that's something she really tries to unpack in this book.
Okay, so let's unpack it. You touched on the history, which is definitely important context here. But what about what she had to say really resonated with you?
Well, one of the things she said really early on in the book that just really struck me was how she was talking about how the very definition of empowerment has almost become distorted in our modern society. So it's like we've been sold this idea that the more detached you can be from sex emotionally, that the more control you have and thus the more empowered you are.
Wow. It's like we're being told to just kind of check our emotions at the door in order to be empowered. Like, did you go into why she thinks that is?
Yeah, she talks a lot about how pop culture and media, so think Sex and the City, or even dating apps like Tinder, how they present this very, glamorized, consequence-free version of casual sex. Like, it's all about freedom and exploration, but it often glosses over all of the, very real emotional complexities that can arise.
Right, because no matter how much modern life tries to tell us, otherwise sometimes we're not robots, right? Like we
Yeah.
are hardwired for connection.
Exactly. And that's where Solomon brings in the science, right? Because she talks about in chapter 5 about oxytocin, which is the bonding hormone that's released during sex. So even when you think that you're engaging in something that's just casual and that you're not emotionally invested, your brain is literally working against you by releasing all these chemicals that are really meant to foster closeness and attachment.
Oh, it's like a biological bait and switch.
Yeah.
Like you think you're signing up for one thing, but your body's experiencing something totally different.
Yeah, it is. And it's that disconnect a lot of times between what we're experiencing physically and then what we're expecting on an emotional level that can really lead to problems down the line. It can lead us to feel used or emotionally drained or maybe even lonelier than we were before.
And especially if you're someone who struggles with anxiety or maybe has a history of trauma in their past, I imagine this kind of emotional dissonance would be really tough.
Yeah, for sure. And that actually kind of leads into another point that Solomon makes in the book. And it's about the spiritual toll that detaching emotions from sex repeatedly can have.
I was kind of wondering when we were going to get to that
Yeah.
because she doesn't shy away from using that term spiritual toll, which feels big and kind of hard to define. So what does she even mean by that?
Right. It's a heavy phrase. She really kind of explores this idea that for a lot of people, sex is about more than just the physical act, right?
Yeah.
It can be an act of vulnerability. It can be an act of really opening yourself up to another person on a much deeper level. And when we engage in that act, but we don't acknowledge or honor the emotional and spiritual aspects of ourselves, it can lead to the sense of emptiness, like we're disconnected from our core selves in some way.
So, okay, so it's not just about like feeling bummed out after a hookup.
Right?
We're talking about something way more profound than that, right?
Yeah.
Like a disconnect from your own needs and desires.
Exactly. And that's where I think her work gets really interesting because she connects this to, I think, a broader societal trend that we're seeing, which is that we live in a culture that often prioritizes instant gratification, external validation over genuine connection.
Yeah.
And so for some people, the pursuit of casual sex can almost become this way to try and fill this void that actually goes much, much deeper.
It's almost ironic because it's often presented as this path to freedom and self-discovery, but it could actually be hindering those things if you're not careful.
Totally. It's a really interesting paradox. And it's not to say that everyone who engages in casual sex is going to experience these negative consequences, right? But I think what Solomon's really encouraging us to do is to be honest with ourselves about our motivations,
Yeah.
about our vulnerabilities. What are we hoping to get out of these experiences?
Which brings us back to this whole idea of empowerment.
Yeah.
Right? Because if true empowerment isn't about detaching from our emotions or seeking validation through casual sex, then what does it actually look like?
That's the million-dollar question. And thankfully, she does offer some answers. She argues that true empowerment starts with self-awareness.
Okay.
So understanding your own values, your needs, your boundaries.
So that's almost like tuning into your own inner compass, as opposed to just blindly following these societal expectations.
Exactly. And that might look different for everybody, right? For some people, that might look like choosing to abstain from casual sex altogether. And for other people, it might look like being more intentional about who they choose to be intimate with, having those open and honest conversations about expectations.
I love how she's kind of reframing this whole conversation around casual sex.
Right.
And I think one of the things you mentioned that I wanted to go back to is this idea of setting boundaries, because I think that's something that a lot of people really struggle with. So can you elaborate on that a little bit? Like, what does she mean by setting boundaries, practically speaking?
Yeah, she really breaks it down in a way that I think is really helpful. Like, she talks about the importance of communicating your needs and your limits, not just in terms of like physical safety, but also emotionally.
Yeah.
So that might look like being upfront about what you're looking for, whether it's purely a physical encounter or if you're open to something more emotionally involved and feeling empowered to say no if something feels uncomfortable for you.
Which I think can be so hard to do,
It can.
especially, in the heat of the moment. You don't want to offend someone or you don't want to come across as being uptight or whatever. But it sounds like what she's saying is that that's actually the coolest thing you can do
Yeah.
because you're showing respect for yourself and for the other person.
100%. And I think that ties into this idea that she talks about, which is, building healthy sexual relationships.
So it's not just about like avoiding the downsides of casual sex. It's like you can actually create positive, fulfilling experiences.
Absolutely.
Tell me more about that.
It is interesting, right? Because, we tend to think of like, the word healthy, like in the context of a long-term relationship. But she's arguing that even casual encounters can be healthy or unhealthy depending on how we're approaching them.
Okay, so how do we do that?
Yeah.
How do we take this idea of like, healthy sexuality into our own lives, especially when it comes to these more casual encounters?
Well, I think, again, she goes back to this idea of honesty being so important. Honesty with ourselves, honesty with our partners. So, like, checking in with your own motivations, being upfront with the other person about what it is that you're looking for, and, moving away from assumptions and really trying to engage in open communication about desires, boundaries, expectations.
Which makes so much sense. I feel like so much heartache could be avoided if we all just got better at talking to each other about this stuff. But it's like we're almost conditioned to play these dating games instead of just being real.
100%. It's like, how do we bring more authenticity into our relationships, whether they last one night or a lifetime? And that starts with being authentic with ourselves first, right?
This has been so eye-opening as we kind of wrap up our deep dive into the illusion of empowerment. I have one final question for you.
Yeah.
If you could go back and give your younger self just one piece of advice about navigating this whole world of casual sex and relationships, what would it be?
Oh, that's a good one. I think I would probably tell myself to worry less about what everybody else is doing and spend more time like cultivating self-love and acceptance. Because I think ultimately that's like, true fulfillment comes from within, and then you can make choices from that place that are really empowered, that lead to genuine happiness and connection.
That's such a good point to end on.
Yeah.
It's not about following some kind of societal script. It's not about trying to like find yourself through other people. It's really about like connecting to your own values, needs, desires.
Exactly, and having the courage to honor those, even when it feels scary or uncomfortable.
I love that. So to everyone listening, here's a little something to ponder. What if the real revolution isn't about how many people we sleep with, but about how deeply we connect with ourselves? Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.